there's not only sad news, there's also some positive signs that, for example, the wolf is reintroducing itself throughout Europe. It's not being reintroduced by anyone. It's doing this on its own accord. My name is Rik Jansen. I come from the Netherlands, both living in the UK right now. And for the last 3 years, we've been campaigning with Animal Rising, working on many nationwide campaigns, trying to start a conversation, a nationwide conversation on the solution of a plant-based food system. So some of these actions you might have seen, disrupting the largest horse race, the Grand National last year, multiple beagle liberations, but also disrupting the dairy industry for a week in 2022. And this is where we experimented with the messaging of rewilding quite a lot. So it's quite relevant to this talk. And I'll pass on to Orla.
Hi everyone, my name is Orla. And my background is actually in nursing. I was a general and children's nurse for a few years, and then I kind of transitioned into vegan activism, working with Animal Rising as well for the last few years on a whole variety of campaigns, as Rik already mentioned. And for the last 9 months as well, just to add in that we have done this 9-month rewilding course, which has given us a lot of information that we've been adding into our course and kind of led us on a lot of these thought loops about rewilding and animal freedom. So the purpose of this talk today is, I guess we have 3 main things that we want to get out of it. The first thing is to give you guys an understanding of rewilding and the situation in Europe at the moment in terms of nature. We then want to talk about nature and its relationship and connection with animals and how that kind of ties into animal liberation. And thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, what we'd like to do is to kind of begin to build on a new vision for animals for the future. Now, we've given this presentation before, and we ran it actually as a 2-hour session, and it was a workshop. And so there was loads of time for participation from you guys. So obviously now we're trying to kind of cram it into half an hour. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a half an hour of speaking, and then we have 10 minutes at the end, which hopefully we'll be able to have some of those good conversations. And also I'd encourage you guys to talk about it amongst yourselves as well throughout the day and throughout the weekend. And as has already been said in the introduction to today, there is a little bit of controversy around rewilding, particularly in the vegan movement. And we'd just like to say, yeah, maybe it would be actually helpful for me just to get a feel of the room. So if you're like really pro rewilding, and you know you are, maybe you put up your hand. This is not a blame and shame moment. Amazing. And if you're quite against rewilding, maybe put up your hand as well. Nice, a few people. Sorry, you're the minority at the moment. And then if you're just kind of on the fence. Cool. Amazing. Well, just to clarify, the purpose of this talk today isn't necessarily for us all to come onto the same page and all agree with each other. The purpose is to start this conversation and to begin to understand the complexity of rewilding and some of these broader topics around rewilding. Does that make sense? And we'll have lots of time at the end as well to kind of go into some questions or controversy. So the first question is, what is rewilding? And rewilding is a process by which we allow nature to recover itself and to heal itself. And sometimes this involves human intervention. For example, when things are really bad, we might need humans to get involved and to help nature recover. But for the most part, it's nature-led. That means nature is doing the majority of the work. This will be before and after. This is in the Lake District, these little cartoons. So to start off, and to kind of bring us all onto the same page, we're going to talk a little bit about the situation in Europe at the moment. So for those of you who don't know, I'm sorry to break the bad news, but Europe is in a biodiversity crisis. You can see Europe there in the center. And this means that 19% of species in Europe are at risk of extinction, which is absolutely off the charts. We can see that multiple areas in Europe would actually be considered to be ecological dead zones, and sometimes entire countries are falling into that category as well. And when you think of the bad countries in Europe, the countries that are perhaps the most ecologically depleted, you might immediately think of maybe the Netherlands, who's very heavily involved in animal agriculture. But it's bigger than that, because also countries like the UK, like Ireland, Wales and Scotland, that are considered these green and luscious countries, where a lot of tourism is drawn there, particularly to the nature, are actually also among the most biodiverse depleted countries. And here you can see people holidaying. That's in Wales. And here we have some more maps where you can really see how bad the situation is at the moment. And I myself, maybe you've heard, I'm from Ireland, and Rik is from the Netherlands as well, so we're particularly invested in this. And then this map depicts the kind of oceanic dead zones. And again, Europe is an absolute epicenter of this. So we're in a very dire situation. Why is this? Well, it probably comes as no surprise to you guys that the number one reason that we are in such dire straits in terms of nature is because of animal agriculture. And the reason this is because half of the land in Europe currently is used for animal farming, or is used for farming, excuse me. And of that land, 70% of it is used for animal agriculture. So this is a massive, massive chunk of Europe that's used for animal agriculture. And one of the biggest studies, if not the most comprehensive study on food and the climate crisis by a man named Joseph Poore, it's an incredible paper, which we will give links if anyone is interested in reading it, has reinforced this information, and it's even gone a step further to talk about the solution. And this paper basically says that if we transition away from animal agriculture, then what we'll actually end up doing is freeing up 70 to 80% of this agricultural land worldwide. And if we free up that land, that gives us an incredible opportunity to actually draw down carbon, to replant forests, to bring back natural habitats for animals as well. Yeah, and this is the study by Joseph Poore.
Right. So, thank you. People will know, picture on the left, intensive farming is bad. It's bad for the animals, it's horrific to the animals, and it's bad for nature. Some people might see extensively grazed animals, as in this picture, as a potential to be both able to farm and nature-friendly. The reality is that both, it's still bad for the animal, it's still quite horrific for the animals, they don't live a long life, but also for nature, it is in many ways worse. You need a lot more land to extensively graze these sheep, for example. So this is a picture of sheep in Wales, and sheep, first of all, is not a native animal to Europe, so it doesn't really fit in the ecosystem here. And it's also being left to their own rulings, really. So sheep, their main plan for the day is put their heads down and eat grass. Normally they would live in like really mountainous areas where like food isn't quite abundant. In Wales, the food is very abundant. So what you get is this situation where the hills are just completely stripped bare. And you might previously have thought that that was quite a natural environment that you would see in Scotland and Wales and maybe other places in the UK, but it's totally not. This place should be quite lush open grasslands, or even in this case, as it's Wales, it should be temperate rainforest. So Europe is actually home to some of the most rare ecosystems in the world, like the temperate rainforest. And it's particularly interesting because the temperate rainforest is really biodiverse, and biodiversity is, it's a nice thing, but it's also good in the sense that the more biodiverse an ecosystem is, the more resilient it is. So here you can see the places in the world where you have this rainforest, essentially. And I can imagine many people who have been to Ireland or Scotland wouldn't have a clue that that even would exist there. But reality is it would. But because of this grazing, it doesn't. And these places, well, this is kind of what it would look like. So it's very dense, plants growing on top of plants, just the sheer humidity of the place allows that to happen. And it feels very mystical. It's like kind of hard to even imagine these places existing. And in a broader way, it's hard to imagine what the nature in Europe should look like. And it makes sense, because we haven't seen it in so long. And to get a real good understanding of that, you have to go back a long time. And that time is basically the last time we had spoilers. The last time where the climate was very similar to today. Not much changed between this period and now, but also it was before human intervention. So we're in a time period 125,000 years ago, the last interglacial, so meaning the warm period between ice ages, basically. And you can see here, this is a kind of a illustration of, sorry, I should be pointing here. This is an illustration of what Europe, or specifically Northwest Europe, would look like around that time. So you can see giant elk would be roaming around in the open grasslands. On bottom left, you see a straight-tusked elephant. Europe used to be home to elephants. Would have been a very normal sight at that stage. But also rhinoceros would walk around. And they all create this landscape, this mixed mosaic of different habitats. So it's not that the whole of Europe used to be one big forest. These animals played a crucial role in creating that environment. The environment is not separate, they're connected. They've evolved together to create this ecosystem. But of course, these animals that you see here, they feel very alien, right? Like, you can't really imagine an elephant walking around Luxembourg here. But it's because we've lost them, right? So from the last interglacial to now, we've basically lost most of these animals. And the straight-tusked elephant on the left there is a huge animal. It would basically function as like nature's bulldozer. If there was a forest in its way, it would walk straight through, clearing up openings, allowing trees to fall over, those dead trees feeding into the soils, allowing other animals, fungi to flourish there, plants to regrow. That's a big function that we're basically missing at the moment, and humans are kind of doing that, but we're clearly not doing a good job at it. We used to have loads of bison. We still do have some that are kind of, still exist in some way. They would eat the bark of a tree, and then if they completely ring bark, it's called ring barking, the tree would basically die, and there would be a stump left over, so dead standing wood. That dead standing wood would then be great habitat for animals like bats, for example. They really thrive in these ecosystems. In many forests right now, you would go on a walk and you wouldn't see any dead wood, because we have this kind of picture in our head, the forest needs to be lovely and lush, and let's remove all the dead wood, and it's been quite sanitized. So these animals have been gone, and that is a trend that you see, that in the last interglacial, you had all these large mammals walking around, and they had a really significant impact. Just the sheer size of them, you can imagine. A big animal would have relatively a bigger impact on the ecosystem, or at least easier to measure. Whereas now we have some moose up in Scandinavia and some other areas, but yeah, loads of them has disappeared, and we used to think that's because the primary reason was climate change, so going from the ice ages into the Holocene, the period that we're in now, the climate has changed, so these animals couldn't survive, but more and more science is actually saying that the primary cause is humans. So humans came to Europe around 40,000 years ago, and they just started hunting more humans start to settle, and these animals slowly started disappearing. And that's quite a key insight. Yeah, pass to you, sorry, you need this.
Sweet. So what that has resulted in is a massive, massive depletion in the amount of species that we have. To the point now we're at that only 4% of wild mammal mammal biomass is actually wild. Everything else, the 96%, is made up of humans and domesticated animals, pets, and food. Animals for food. And why? Why has this been able to happen, and why is there not absolute outrage because of it? And it's due to something called shifting baseline syndrome. Hands up if you've heard of shifting baseline syndrome. Ah, amazing. So this will be not new to you guys, but it basically is the concept that we can almost remember the reality of our parents, and then we can understand the reality of our grandparents. But beyond that, it becomes incredibly difficult for us to understand that was a reality, and to really visualize what that world would have been like. So an example of this would be my father, for example, telling me that he would go swimming and he would could see fish in the ocean. And then perhaps his grandparents say that they were in the rivers and the rivers were full of fish. And we can understand both of those realities, even though when we go swimming now, we see almost no fish. But it's very hard for us to understand anything further than that. So the generations before our grandparents, those memories and those realities are almost lost to us. And so that's why it's incredibly important that we begin to build a new vision for the future. And this is some examples that I find quite interesting of shifting baseline syndrome. Here we have the moors in the UK, which are considered like a national heritage spot. We have some wild grasslands that are obviously being grazed by animals. And this is often what we think of when we think of a forest, which is actually a plantation woodland that's incredibly dark. And this is where the idea has come from that's very prominent in the UK, for example, that says that a squirrel could, back in the old days, that a squirrel could jump from branch to branch and go all the way from the very south of Ireland or of England and reach the very top. This idea of having a really dense woodland, but it's completely false. And these are some ideas of, I guess, how nature could and should look if we were really, really used to it. This is wetlands here in the bottom. You can see that it's an incredible habitat for birds. And this is more of an open forest, again, an incredible habitat for lots of small animals. And again, the oceans teeming with fish. When we talk about, when I was writing this presentation, I was thinking a lot about habitat, and I looked up the word, and it actually comes from Latin, and the word habitat means to dwell. And so when we're looking at these habitats, it can be difficult to remember that every single one of these is a home to so many animals, hundreds and thousands of animals. And as we have, over the years, began to domesticate so many different animals, we've not only taken away their home and sense of place, but we've also taken away their sense of agency or their purpose within those environments. To the point where it's actually quite difficult for us to understand now the complexity of it all and how those complex relationships have worked together for thousands and millions of years between animals, between nature. Sorry, this slide is actually very blurry, but I thought it would be interesting to maybe just have a quick look at that complexity and of the functions of animals within their individual ecosystems, and specifically looking at kind of keystone species. A keystone species is a species that is so important and so critical to the ecosystem that were that species to be depleted or were to be taken away from that ecosystem, the ecosystem would be altered completely, and even sometimes the whole ecosystem would collapse. And more animals are playing these keystone species roles within their ecosystems. And I have a lovely example of the otter on the Pacific coast of America. Unfortunately, these otters were hunted to the point of near extinction on the Pacific coast. And what people noticed was that the kelp forests along the Pacific coast in America disappeared almost completely along with this otter. And the scientists were initially quite baffled because the otter has no interaction with kelp. But on examining this and on researching what had happened, they learned that the otter's favorite food are these sea urchins, and the otter was eating the sea urchins and keeping the ecosystem in balance. But when the otter was depleted, there was a huge burst in the amount of sea urchin and the population of sea urchins, and sea urchins feed on the kelp. So when there was a boom of the sea urchins, there was a complete drop in the kelp forests. that had been previously drawing down the carbon.
Thank you. Yeah, and some other examples of kind of trying to illustrate this complexity that happens is in the Yellowstone National Park in America. So Yellowstone National Park is a really huge national park that is quite biodiverse, but for the last 100 years, it didn't have any wolves. They were basically hunted to extinction in that area. And then in '95, they decided to reintroduce wolves to the park. And what happened was quite impressive. So the wolves, they were reintroduced. Well, they obviously are hunting the deer, but they also created this behavior of fear around certain areas on the riverside. So this was an initial reaction that happened as the wolves were reintroduced. For a time being, the deer avoided these riverbanks. You can imagine around a river, it's an easier territory for a wolf to prey on an animal. So this behavior existed for a while, and it allowed a window in time for plants and trees and shrubs to grow. The deer, they love eating everything they see, but if it's tall enough, they can't really eat it anymore, right? So the willows, they spur up and they reinforce the riverbanks. When this reinforcement happened, it meant that the beaver could then the beaver was able to reintroduce itself into that territory. It had more wood to cut down, but also just more protection from the riverbanks. A beaver, what they do, they're in their own way a keystone species. They slow down the river by building the dams, so the river goes wide and it slows down. There's more water being held in that place that the dams are built, and that allowed both the water to be of better quality, but also just more abundance. That allowed more fish to reintroduce themselves, which then you can imagine has an effect on the amount of birds of prey that would roam around this area. Now, there's a lot of complexity to this, where there's claims that this has been like totally re-changed the course of rivers and the whole park in general. It's really hard to study these things. So I think, yeah, you need to appreciate that whilst we know that there are some cascade of effects happening from the reintroduction or the removing from one animal, we know that there's connections, but it's really actually hard to know for sure what happens. So yeah, the complexity in this is something you really do have to start to embrace, because even, I'm not an ecologist, but you can imagine that ecologists, even if they can't fully understand all the dynamics, I'm certainly not going to be able to. And something more controversially, the role of dead bodies or dead animals in the system is a really crucial part that is very, is hard for us to even look at, but it's important to acknowledge that, you know, the complexity runs all the way through this, where, we basically have built this sanitized death to the point where we don't view it as a process, it's just an event, a sad moment in someone's life. When in reality, there are so many animal species, plants and fungi that literally rely on these processes, the death as part of life, that wouldn't exist or wouldn't function in that ecosystem. And yeah, in general, it's important to, you might get a sense that you want to intervene in nature to help reduce this suffering, which to a certain extent you probably could do that, but you have to acknowledge the fact that both these systems are super complex. So knowing the effect, for example, the otters, or if you would remove the sea urchins, the studies are so hard to find. There's very little definite answers, a lot of questions. So without knowing for sure that something doesn't have a negative effect on an ecosystem, you would probably want to be quite careful. And maybe more importantly, avoiding the situation where nature becomes fully dependent on the control of humans and the continuation of that control in the future. There's not only sad news, there's also some positive signs that, for example, the wolf is reintroducing itself throughout Europe. It's not being reintroduced by anyone. It's doing this on its own accord. making its way further and further west and south in Europe, obviously being met with quite a lot of negativity, but I would say this is quite a good sign. Equally, the moose is trying to do this, but it's kind of being blocked basically by roads. So the moose, it used to be native to places in the Netherlands or the UK or even France. Obviously, not exist there now, but it is trying to move across from Poland into Europe. So this shows that there is some positive light, but there is also, the reality is still that biodiversity globally is still declining. So we're definitely in a race against the clock to try and reinforce and reestablish these ecosystems before time runs out. So that is why urgent action is needed on this level. It's also a really political issue where farmers are directly protesting against green rules being put in place. But at the same time, the governments are in some way showing some willingness to implement rules based on nature restoration. Sorry, I've seen the time. I'm trying to finish this. In general, I think it's a great sign, this future vision of rewilding that I'm really excited about, and I think I would really love to have some conversations with people afterwards, both if you disagree or agree with people around this topic. Also, if people have energy to campaign around this, as I would view it, it's a really potent concept to strategize around, reinforce this narrative, and get together a network of people, or even a campaign around this. I would be very eager to have conversations with people, so definitely approach either of us after this talk. I think just to summarize this talk, I think rewilding, restoring nature, is not only like a key solution to the climate crisis, or with a plant-based food system. It's not only a key solution to the climate crisis, it's also allowing us to want to create a better future, a world that is actually worth longing for, a world that is worth fighting for, where animals can truly be free. So I think that's where I'll end it, unless you have anything to add.
No, I don't think so. It'd be great to maybe have a bit of time for a Q&A to kind of get people thinking.
I did run over slightly. I apologize.
Well, you're good. You're doing perfect. Thank you. So thank you so much for this presentation, Orla and Rik. Are there any questions in the audience? Yes.
Hello. Thank you very much for your very interesting talk. I've just got a question, and I don't have an opinion, right? But what you consider to be the role of population control in human population control and rewilding? Like, are they is rewilding compatible with unlimited human population growth?
I think what we've shown is that there's a lot of land that is being used for animal agriculture where we have alternatives to animal agriculture. So animal agriculture just totally doesn't have a role, right? It doesn't have a function. We have alternatives. So all that land, there is in theory space for both nature, both more people. It becomes a problem when you start to think about people still wanting to eat animals, and with the example of extensively reared animals, you run into troubles where you just use more land, nature starts to deplete, and you run into a situation where ecosystems just deteriorate. So, yeah, it depends. If you believe in a plant-based food system, I don't think that's the main issue.
Okay, there was another question over here.
Thank you. Less of a question and just more something to add and to reinforce, I think, the importance of this. And to link it a little bit with the climate science as well. And it's usually something that not many people understand or know. So the reason we're given a carbon budget in the first place is because the IPCC climate models have already optimistically assumed that our food system goes from a carbon source to a carbon sink in the next 25 years. And at the current rate of how we are depleting our carbon budget, we will run out of that for a 1.5 warmer world in the next 2 years. And so what we are talking about is this land system transformation that is so enormous in such a short space of time. Even pioneering Earth system scientists are saying this is an agricultural revolution that needs to happen so quickly. The only possible way of doing this is to first reclaim the land. As Joseph Paul's study says, we can reclaim as much as 75% of it if the world adopted a vegan diet, and then to rewild it, because that provides core ecosystem functions, which is like carbon sequestration. So this is very big. This needs to happen immediately, but there is nuances, of course, in the re-establishment of these. You have to steward them into existence. You can't expect just to plant some trees and animals to go back. So I just want to reinforce that, because it's usually something that many people do not know, that this source to sink transformation has to occur, because it has already been assumed in the IPCC climate models.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for pointing that out as well. And something that I found really worrying is that we've been in contact with a lot of different rewilding groups and kind of speaking to them and getting their perspectives. And what I found really worrying is that a lot of the rewilding groups are feeling immense pressure from the farming communities. And because of that, they're starting to adopt this narrative of regenerative animal farming, and that it's possible to, graze lots and lots of cows and, sell them for very expensive meat and still do this rewilding work. But even in, maybe some of you have heard of NEP, I thought it was really, really interesting, so I'm going to go on a little bit of a tangent. But they had two different areas in NEP, and one of them they introduced grazing cows to very quickly. I think it was within 7 years. And the other field, they didn't quite have the budget for that yet, so they let that rewild longer. And we can see massively in the field that was let rewild for longer without any intervention and was allowed to fully recover, has done already much, much better in terms of ecology. So that's why I think it's crucially important that we as a vegan movement become really a heavy voice in this rewilding conversation sooner rather than later.
Okay, thank you. So we do have one question from the online audience. If you could just read it out, please.
Testing. Okay, the question is, regarding the loss of wild living animals, if only 4% of mammal biomass is still free living, do you have stats for the remaining percentage of free living sea creatures as opposed to the increasing farmed fishes populations?
No, unfortunately, I don't think we have that ready. I haven't personally seen the comparison with sea creatures, so that study might be there. I am not aware of it, unfortunately.
My understanding is that it's much worse than we had originally thought, and that the sea life, I think I'm pulling from Seaspiracy at this stage, but that the oceanic populations, I think, have been depleted by, I think, 80%. Maybe I'm going off script now.
Yeah, watch Seaspiracy, I guess.
I'm sorry, I don't have that information.
Okay, we have another question here.
It's more a comment. I got the impression that you were almost apologetic when the dead deer was visible, that you said, okay, true, there is suffering, what can we do about it? I would just say that the ultimate goal for me of animal liberation is for them living free and autonomous, which might well mean more suffering. Freedom often means more suffering, but it's freedom that I'm aiming for, and that I think our movement should be aiming for. Freedom, autonomy, do as they please without human domination and without human intervention.
Yeah, I'm just massively resonate with that. And yeah, like I said, my background is in nursing, and I've seen a lot of people suffering. I've seen a lot of people dying. And I think that the freedom is absolutely more important, is the thing that we should be reaching for. Yeah. Time for one more?
Yeah, I just kind of a little bit in line with this. I was wondering about your thoughts on the ethics behind human involvement in rewilding projects, because I know at least in Denmark, where I'm from, A lot of the rewilding projects happen in relatively small areas behind fences, which can be quite difficult for animals to actually still live natural lives. And there's also the involvement of like taking individuals away from their original place of living and moving them to somewhere else, and like this whole human involvement. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a good question, actually. This is a big issue where most nature reintroduction programs, thinking of the big example in the Netherlands, for example, the Oostvaardersplassen, a lot of people are talking about this as it's a place where like deer and wild horses are meant to be like sustaining their own population and free. The reality is that this place, whilst it's kind of a good initiative that started in something like the 60s, it was probably started with the right intentions. The reality is it's a fenced off area, so leaving animals to their own devices and saying that the herds will boom and bust into an equilibrium is not fully fair when they're not able to migrate to other places. So with all these things, it's always a key point is size. At the same time, you need to start somewhere. So there's the road to this liberation of animals and rewilding large parts of Europe is not going to come without any mistakes. And I think that's also something to embrace, that you can't reintroduce, for example, the wolf into the UK. They're not going to swim over the channel. They can't do that. But I would like to think at some point we would be able to do that. That's probably going to come at a lot of controversy, perhaps some mistakes, but somehow you need to try to get there. And the size is the main thing, basically.
Okay, so we are actually running out of time. I think, does anyone have like a really quick question? I know I saw some hands up over there as well. The long one? Okay. So quick question? Okay, let's do that.
Yeah, so I guess we all understand the urgency of rewilding and why it's essential for a plant-based food system, for animal liberation. But given the political situation, like just how to do this, because the most efficient way would be for national governments to buy out or phase out animal farming and give this land back to scientists in combination with animal organizations and rewilding it. But given the political situation, I don't see that happening. So are there also alternative routes for like private, people buying a land and then do this maybe through a more grassroots strategy? Like, are there any alternatives?
Yeah, this is a huge question. No, it's a great question, but perhaps we can talk about it afterwards in more depth as well. But I think the answer is we need everything. So we need people campaigning central government. We need like more radical direct action, if I can say that on camera. We also need independent people, landowners to come together to be rewilding their land, and we also need individuals taking land back. But what I would love is for after this we'll be I think we're going to go to the wooden thing outside, and we'd love to have a conversation with anyone who's interested in this and interested in thinking more strategically about it.
All right.
I have
so
a
much.
quick comment from the online audience. There's Annemarie Botzky, who said she's an activist from Germany organizing a rewilding conference and is interested to connect on the idea to create a larger campaign on rewilding. So please reach out, and she left her email address, so please.
Amazing.
Great, that's great.
Reach out to us. Thank you.
Incredible, thank you so
All right,
much.
thank you so much.